Hello everyone, my name is Rob Phillips. I'm recording this video from lovely St. Paul, Minnesota. As you can see, it's a very sunny, warm day outside, which, if you know Minnesota, uh, is a very wonderful thing. Anyway, my goal with this video is to provide a potential solution for some of for what I consider to be a pretty intractable problem, and that is, to compete with lobbyists to allow the general population to have a much more say in and much more effect in the legislative process. In 2014, there was a study by Martin Gillens of Princeton University and Benjamin Page of Northwestern University, and it was called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. If you did a Google search, you'd be able to find the study. But essentially, the point of it was to show, and I think it did a pretty good job of showing very strongly, that there is an outsized influence and an outsized ability to get legislation passed for a very small percentage of our population relative to the rest of the population. So essentially, the argument was that it is kind of a socioeconomic relationship between ability to get legislation passed and the ability to get legislation passed that you are advocating for relative to the general population. My goal with this video is to present a solution that I am calling a blockchain voting path. Oftentimes, you'll hear people, when they propose blockchain solutions, you'll hear a couple things. You'll hear ridicule. You'll hear, no, I'm not going to ever do that. You'll hear crypto, right? So we are definitely in what people are calling a crypto winter. So crypto is taking a hit. A lot of projects that were previously respected are going out the window. But if you think about it, this is what happened during the internet era. Lots of companies went under because their technology was inadequate. Lots of money lost, lots of money gained. This is how it works. And the same thing is happening in the blockchain space. So my proposed solution is something that I'm calling a blockchain voting path, PAF. A path, you can say path, PAC. One of the definitions of those particular two entities now are there's lots of rules about who can give to it, how much they can give, what the money can be used for, and so on and so forth, right? And I'm not suggesting that these paths in and of themselves be changed. My purpose is to provide another methodology that we can use that will give us an opportunity, all of us an opportunity, to affect legislation or to affect issue advocacy in a way that we hadn't previously been able to do. And from an architecture perspective, what we're talking about is something that I call a BV path. And the primary characteristic of it is it's just a fund, right? But the difference between a path PAC and this particular fund is that it is anonymous. So in other words, you have people from all over giving, donors, right? It could be anybody. It doesn't matter who the donors are per se. I would like to, at some point in time, see donations to this particular path as a public service, right? So we pay our taxes, and the money goes into this fund to do some of these things that I'm going to talk about here in just a bit. So you have donors, and however many there are, it doesn't matter in this particular case, because at this point in time, this is just a thought experiment. It is an architectural definition of what we can do. So I will explain the idea of anonymous, why it needs to be anonymous here in a second. But the point of it is that it's a wallet, and it has a base of crypto. Um, Now I have identified, as you can see, I'm wearing a Cardano hat. I was at Consensus 2022, but I've identified a very good option for the crypto that we can use for this particular fund. And ADA, run it on the Cardano blockchain because there's some additional things that I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit. But the fund is anonymous, and if you're donating crypto at this present scenario, that's pretty much how it works anyway. Because what they're going to do is they are going to send some money from their wallets, and they are going to receive some money over here, and there is a key or an address. So it doesn't really give too much information or very little information about who actually sent the money into the wallet. But once we have that established, that we have a fund, and there are the people that, or the things that donate it to it, are anonymous. The additional part of this is an app, and I'm not going to go into the details of exactly what the app was, but there is what I call a blockchain, or a blockchain voting block of people. And each one of those blockchain voting block entities, one voter, one, two, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many there are, right? They are registered with this thing called a Prism. And this is an important point because a Prism is what is called a self-sovereign digital ID, decentralized digital ID, and that's the key to it too. Decentralized digital ID, self-sovereign digital ID. So I want to take a moment to explain the difference, for example, between a self-sovereign decentralized digital ID and a digital ID that you may be familiar with, for example, from Google, right? So Google offers, and I honestly think it works pretty well for the most part, a digital ID. So if you log in with your Google account, you can log into all kinds of different services and things like that. That is a digital ID, and there's a whole bunch of different ones. But Google, for me, is probably the biggest one. But the difference between a self-sovereign decentralized DID and a DID, for example, from Google, is that the decentralized one is owned by you, right? So it is what goes in it is your information. What goes in it is your stuff, and it's distributed between all of the nodes that are available on the network. So no matter where you are, you can go and log in with your self-sovereign decentralized DID, right? I mean, in some ways, you can do a lot of the same thing, but the thing about Google is that it owns your identity, right? It owns the data that you produce. It owns it owns your name on there, right? It owns the information that you provide, your address, and all kinds of different things. And in all honesty, that has allowed Google to provide some pretty good services, and I'm not advocating for Google here. I'm just saying that it was a big step from needing to log into every damn application, having 5 million passwords for whatever it is we do, right? So the other part of this is that at some point in time, you may see, for example, a government, our government, produce its own DID. And I would be very leery of that because the government, if they produce it, they own it. You don't own it. They own it. And they can get information from it. They can put stuff into it. They can take stuff out of it. They can do pretty much whatever it is they want to track your information wherever you use this DID, right? There is a really good example of this in China with something called the digital yuan, right? I definitely don't want the United States to get to the point where we are similar to China in that respect. Okay, so let's get back here. So we have our fund, and we have the blockchain voting path, right? So each one of these individuals who registers in with the decentralized digital ID, a teleprism in this case, has information in it, for example, about who you are, where you are. It could have your driver's license. It could have your educational credentials. It could have all kinds of different things that describe you. But just remember that you own it, right? You have the ability to let people see it. You have the ability to not let people see it. And I think if we were to introduce a decentralized digital ID into America effectively, we could have an alternative social security system. We could have more control of our data so that we could actually have a data economy so that we can profit from our data. But that's a little bit beyond the problem I'm trying to solve here. So we have our blockchain voting block, BC voting block with however many members are in the blockchain voting block. And there's an application associated with this that goes through this process of figuring out, for example, your location, your, what congressional district you might be in. For example, if you were in Minnesota, I would be in Congressional District 4, and so on and so forth, right? So the app basically looks at your sovereign ID information and makes some determinations, and it uses that to do things like set up a scenario where it can tell you and be aware of what votes are happening at a particular certain date, right? And what votes you may be able to be involved in because of where you're located and so on and so forth, right? But the point is that once a vote comes into play, right, and you have the ability to say, I want to vote for this issue, or I want to vote for this candidate, or I want to vote for providing some funds to someone who supports an issue that I support, right? So what happens is it goes through this phase of telling you which votes you may be available to enter, right? And then what it does is it gives you a vote. But the problem is because this is on the blockchain, you have this issue of transaction costs and stuff like this, right? There are some issues on some blockchains with transaction costs because they do something called forward processing or something like that, particularly with the Ethereum blockchain. What happens is when a transaction is put out onto the network, some of the miners have this ability, well, not some, but all of them have this ability to say, I will get paid more for this particular transaction, so I'm going to put it higher in the hierarchy. So that transaction is going to get executed first. In this particular case, we can't do that. And it's one of the reasons why I really support Cardano, because one of the things we have with Cardano is this thing called predetermined costs. Predetermined costs. So in other words, we know beforehand how much the transaction is actually going to cost. So and then we also the other part about it is that it is fixed, right? And I will say this: it's low cost relative to some other blockchains. So these are some of the primary things that make me think that Cardano is a much better solution for some of these things. So what happens is there's this introduction of a smart contract that is able to tell how much transaction is going to cost, because I don't know if you guys are all familiar with how basically how crypto works in this particular case, but there's a large amount of infrastructure out there that are being run by people who are providing the physical infrastructure, the compute resources and things, right? And they need to get paid, and so this is what crypto is ultimately designed to do, because it's the only way to support a decentralized system. And that is really the primary advantage of any of this stuff, is to have a decentralized system, right? So a smart contract comes into play, takes a little bit of money from the fund, distributes it to each individual's wallet, and its purpose is to pay for the transaction costs. I mean, just think about it. We could not have a voting mechanism that forced the population to pay for voting. It just wouldn't work, right? It's absurd. And so the whole point of a BV path is to take and sort of use this fund as kind of a public service to distribute money enough to pay for the transaction costs, right? So we have once the money has been distributed to each one of the wallets of the blockchain voting population, they will then have an opportunity to vote for whatever the issue may be. And again, it could be anything. It could be for ranked choice voting. It could be for for some environmental thing. It could be anything, really. It could be for some candidate. However the voting populace decides it wants to figure out what what the money should go to, right? So the other part of this, let's say you have a candidate who is really strongly supporting ranked choice voting or some issue that you want, and you want to give them support, right? So we can set up a vote, and we can say, I want to reward this particular candidate's or this particular issue's activity in whatever action they're doing, whether they're supporting ranked choice voting strongly, where they're running environmental, they provide some sort of environmental solutions and things like that, right? So what will happen is a vote will happen, and whatever the results of the vote are, right? And I guess you can say that there might be some idea of how much money or how much of the funds that we want to distribute to that particular issue, to that candidate. I mean, the issue is that we want to be able to provide support for people who support issues that we believe in, right? And so the issues that we believe in are all going to be voted on by the blockchain voting population. But again, the point is that each person only gets one vote. So this is the idea of anonymous fund, right? So if each person gets only one vote, doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter how much money they gave to the fund. In fact, you don't need to become part of the blockchain voting population here. You do not need to give any money to the fund, right? You are simply given the power and authority by registering with the with your decentralized digital ID and becoming part of the voting population. There is no buy-in. There is nothing that suggests that you have to add to the coffers to become part of the blockchain voting population. So this gives equal access to everybody, no matter who they are, right? No matter how much money they make, no matter where they're located. I mean, obviously within the United States. And so that's one of the, I'll go back and say one of the things about the app is that it's able to make some determinations on which things you might be eligible to vote on, right? So obviously we wouldn't let someone in, Florida vote on some issue that's happening in California, right? So once the vote is done, right, it gets tallied up immediately, right? And depending on the output of the vote, the outcome of the vote, I should say, it will automatically enable a smart contract that will execute against the fund whatever the blockchain voting population thought it should be. So if they wanted to, for example, give $50,000 to some organization that was really working for some of the things that you believed in, you could do that, right? So the smart contract then will go through its process, and then it will send whatever, $50,000 or whatever it is. I'm just guessing numbers here, but the smart contract will do it. It will subtract it from the fund, send it to the individual, and then the individual can receive it, and they can do whatever they want to with it, whatever's within the realm of what they are capable of doing, right? So there's no way for any particular person who gives to the fund to have an outsized influence over any particular person in the blockchain voting population. I mean, they could know each other personally, right? So someone could say, "Oh, I donated $50,000 to the fund," and they might know someone who's in the blockchain voting population, and they can tell each other if they want to. There's nothing stopping them from doing it. But essentially, this fund and whoever donates it is almost by necessity anonymous, right? So again, it doesn't stop communication in a lot of ways outside of this whole technical thing. It is really just there so that any particular person who donates to the fund has no outsized influence over, any more, any more things here than any normal person, right? So some rich person couldn't, simply by donating more money to the fund, have an outsized influence over whoever is in this voting thing, right? There is, I guess there is some potential issues for what might be considered a 51% attack, right? It means that if someone out here can, say, get a coalition, which is essentially what we're having right now is a coalition. Trump has a coalition, but you have a coalition of people, and effectively, when you go to a vote, if you can convince them that 51% of whatever the votes are going to be, you could maybe have some outsized influence there. But what I'm telling you is that it's a much, much, much better system than what we have now, right? Typically, a blockchain, a path has a treasurer, a board, and whoever gives to the path, if they want to be able to control how the money's spent, which they probably always do, right? Now, I will say that there's a difference between a PAF and a super PAF. A super PAC, I should say. A PAC is very limited, but a super PAC is almost anybody can give to it. You know, businesses, rich, they can give thousands and thousands of dollars to it. And there's some limits to how that money can use. But we're not really talking about a super PAC. We're talking about a PAC. So I want to go through this. Okay, I want to spend a moment or two talking about transaction costs because those are ultimately going to be important for this particular thing, right? So we've already established that transaction costs can be non-determinant in the Ethereum network, and there's probably other networks where that indeterminacy may be true as well, right? So one of the nice things about Cardano, again, is that it's determinant, it's predetermined, I should say. It's fixed and it's low cost. There was recently a pretty bad situation in Ethereum where a bunch of what are called NFT drops were made, and people tried to collect their NFTs, and they couldn't get them because if you looked at the transactions, they were stuck in this state, right? And they were stuck in the state of not being done. So in other words, the miners never put those transactions on, you know, they figured the cost of fulfilling those transactions was too low, so they never got put on, on the blockchain. And this is what happens sometimes with Ethereum in particular, because the cost of a transaction is determined by market factors, right? So if there's a bunch of stuff that is going on, and we put a voting transaction out on the blockchain, and because the miners feel that, oh, that transaction cost is not, we're not going to make much money from it, so we're going to put it down in the hierarchy, and it's going to be more difficult to get that transaction fulfilled. I mean, just from the perspective of a healthy voting system, I mean, that would be absurdly ridiculous to do that, right? So we need a system where the 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 transaction of the voting mechanisms are given equal access to the blockchain as any other transaction, right? I'm not necessarily saying they have um, more ability to get put on the blockchain, but we certainly can't give them less. It should be a FIFO, a first in, first out. It should be, you know, get it going. And so this is one of the nice things about Cardano. Uh, Fixed, predetermined, low cost sort of thing, right? Um, so one of the things you're going to hear about quite a bit is this idea of a DAO. Now, I like DAOs. I think they're pretty cool. But one of the things about a DAO is that you have buy-in, right? You have in outsized governance authority by different parties, right? Governance authority is mixed. Because what happens is you contribute to the DAO, right? And if you contribute a lot, you get quite a lot of governance authority. There might be something called a governance token where they distribute a number of governance tokens to you based on the amount of money you get. And so the the fundamental uh, the fundamental relationship between being able to have a voting mechanism that is not a DAO is uh, is just that you have outsized, or you have differing governance authorities. And if we're building a blockchain voting mechanism We cannot have different governance authority, right? I mean, that is also one of the things about a DAO is that if you are the founders of the DAO, the developers of the DAO, you have perhaps the most governance authority, right? And I know that there are blockchains and there are DAOs that are actually trying to work through these problems, but we cannot have, first off, in a generalized blockchain voting scheme, we cannot have buy-in, no buy-in. That would be absurd. So that's primarily why the fund exists, is so that any person who's a member of the blockchain voting population has enough money to pay for transaction costs and to execute their funds, right? To execute their votes. So no buy-in. And then everybody has equal governance authority. Equal governance authority. Again, if you're on the blockchain voting population, one vote, one person. That's it. No more, no less. That's it. This isn't a DAO. That's why I'm calling it a blockchain, a BV path. So, to make a long story short, it is a methodology to compete with things like lobbies. It's a methodology to compete with super PACs. I mean, in and of itself, super PACs can be very powerful because they can support issues in any amount that they want, right? So we are seeking a way to do two things. We are seeking a way to compete with the lobbyists and the super PACs as individual people, so that when Martin Gilens does that study again in 10 years or however many years it takes to actually redo that study, the data is going to be different, right? A small percentage of the population should not have more governance authority over our legislature and the outcomes than any particular person. It should be completely equal. And that's one of the whole points of this thing. So compete with lobbyists and super PACs. But the other thing that I'm trying to accomplish with this is I'm trying to make a model for a generalized blockchain voting mechanism, right? So I hear a lot of people say, oh, just make a blockchain voting mechanism. And you know what? I mean, they're right to a point, but I haven't seen anybody start to build anything, right? So this is my attempt at building. Anyway, the crux of it is a fund, a blockchain voting population, a smart contract, or more than one smart contract, an app that can make some decisions about whether you're eligible to do this or that, and then a fund that the smart contract is responsible for doing two things. It's for executing on the outcome of a vote, but also distributing funds for transaction costs. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's it. I hope you found this interesting. I know it's a little bit crazy. I am maybe not the best public speaker in this particular sense, but I believe in this, and I believe that this is a solution that we can actually implement in a very concrete way. Thanks again. Bye.